So are you going to treat my autism? I don't want to treat my autism. Science has its own language, and sometimes it can feel a bit demeaning to people who, like myself, I've actually adopted my neurodivergence as part of my identity. There's been another study as well to do with prediction of autism from the gut microbiome and blood from umbilical cords, babies like under 1. I find that completely fascinating, but I'm a bit worried about the dark side, because the dark side is...
We've had such a great response to the podcast, and so many of you have been in touch asking what you can do to help. It's really simple. Just follow, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. That way we can reach more people, and that way we can celebrate these great minds that think differently. Our next guest is a neuroscientist, applied microbiologist, and holistic health expert with over 20 years' experience. Dr. Miguel Mateas has developed a unique expertise in the fascinating connections between neurodivergence, mental health, and the gut microbiome. In this episode, Dr. Miguel dives into some groundbreaking and at times unsettling discoveries in neuroscience and neurodivergence. Let's get into it. Let's see how great minds think differently. I'd love an explanation of what the gut microbiome is and how it relates to neurodivergence.
So the gut microbiome is the collection of microbes that live in your gut, plus the things that they produce as a result of living in your gut. So they will create products of their own metabolism. So living in your gut, they will pick up nutrients from the food that you eat. They will transform those nutrients into various different things. Those are those things that I talked about, those products. And it could be, those things might be the building blocks for neurotransmitters. For example, tryptophan, that is the building block for serotonin.
Okay.
Or tyrosine, which is the building block for dopamine. So that's kind of it's a transformation role that they have.
And why is there this connection between our gut and our brain?
Physical wiring between the gut and the brain, which is the vagus nerve, and it's got two sides, the front side and the back side, and also like a mesh that innervates the whole of the gut. So it's picking up signals from what's going on in the gut, because those microbes are talking to each other. So when lactobacillus is producing some bit of acetic acid, that's talking to some bifidobacteria saying, this is available for you to further process it if you want it. Do you want to eat some of this acetic acid and do something else with it? And also those products, those bits of molecules that they produce, go onto your blood. So they become a bit of a Wi-Fi communication system as well. So not just via the vagus nerve, that goes directly from the gut into the emotional control area of the brain, the limbic system and the amygdala and all that kind of area of the brain, the hippocampus, memory. So there's that kind of communication system that is really important in neurodivergence, because we struggle with emotion control, emotion regulation. We struggle with impulsivity. We struggle with mood. And there is science now confirming that in all of those areas, what those microbes are doing in your gut plays a really big role.
So is it fair to say that if you are neurodivergent, we should be over-indexing our attention on looking after our guts?
Absolutely, yeah.
And what do we know about neurodivergent guts?
We know that they are slightly different, and that we have slightly less diversity than maybe a neurotypical gut. So that's because certain microbes actually really like it in our guts, and they might do things that are a little bit naughty. So they might produce or might actually lead to more inflammation, for example. And that happens in the case of autism. Okay. So we have some certain bacteria that are more linked to inflammation, which is always tricky, because there's never a microbe that is absolutely awful unless it's a pathogen that is like, I don't know, H. pylori that drills your stomach. Okay. And then you do know that it's never going to be a good thing to have H. pylori. But in terms of the bacteria that live in the colon, even if some might have this pro-inflammatory kind of role, they are also communicating to other microbes that might actually do something about that. So they all play a part in this theater play that is going on in the gut, basically.
Basically, it's all so interconnected.
Exactly. And what we do know from science is that neurodivergent people have got less of this diversity. So we have pockets that are quite condensed with certain microbes. So we have this microbe called Egerthella, for example, which is supposed to be a pathogen, but it's only a pathogen when it goes over a certain level.
Okay.
And it behaves in this kind of like naughty way. Below that level, it's perfectly fine to have it in your gut, and it's doing what commensal bacteria do, what bacteria who normally live in the gut. We know that in autism, we have more of this Egerthella, and also in ADHD.
People listening who are neurodivergent might have gut issues, might be having tests done. And maybe practitioners who don't know enough about neurodivergence, what should they be looking for?
These names come out of scientific studies done on stool samples, which is something that I've been looking at for a while. And I did my doctoral degree in that particular area, in the connection between the gut and the brain and mental health. A blood test is not going to pick up the fact that you might have Egerthella in your gut over a certain level. It's not even going to pick up whether you have Egerthella at all.
Okay.
So it would need to be a stool sample. Now, with stool samples, the caveat is that if you go to the NHS or your local social service and say, I want to test my poo, can you tell me what is in there? They'll have pathways for that to be tested. So they'll be looking for something specific, as opposed to just give you an idea,
getting a general read.
Exactly. This is a catalog of your gut bacteria. So for that kind of thing, you need to go to a private provider, basically.
Okay.
And then it's a bit of a rabbit hole as well, because it's very interesting. But at the same time, what we know from science is that the gut microbiome is changing all the time. So when it comes to the taking care of your gut as a neurodivergent person, I think if you get the basics right, and make sure that you have a diet that is full of colors, that is fresh produce as much as possible, and there's not a huge amount of sugar or kind of like processed foods in there, you're probably just covering most of the basics.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you've got something specific,
then work with a practitioner who can guide you specifically as to which way to go.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I keep being served these adverts on Instagram about the vagus nerve. And I haven't properly looked into it, other than to see that all these devices to turn your vagus nerve on. What is going on there?
So there is a relatively new way of actually making your vagus nerve work in a slightly different way. You put a device onto your ear here, and through that little bit of the ear, you transmit a signal that is picked up by the vagus nerve. And you need to wear the device for a fair amount of time. So if you read the instructions, on Instagram, everything looks like, somebody making a pancake. It looks amazing in 10 seconds and you're trying to make it and it's completely crap. It doesn't work. And with this, it gives you that idea as well that it's just magic. You just wear these for 10 minutes and your depression is gone or something.
Yes.
And the reality is that there is science behind it.
Okay.
But you do need to wear the device a fair amount of time. So maybe an hour a day and constantly as well.
What's the benefit?
So especially in cases of depression, anxiety, there is the way that the communication between the gut and the brain is working and the way that the vagus nerve is working is a little bit out of sync.
Okay.
Especially if you have a situation of anxiety or you have an experience of trauma, early life adversity, your nervous system has been trained to be in a state of hypervigilance.
Yes.
So you're basically like a meerkat looking for what is going on. And your vagus nerve is kind of like plugged straight into the area of the brain that deals with memory. So the hippocampus, the amygdala, which is linked to the fight or flight response, and other structures in that section of the brain. Those areas are literally receiving that hypervigilance, the message of that hypervigilance, and they are activated all the time. So in some cases, what you want to do with the vagus nerve device is to tone down that hypervigilance. So it's not always about activation. And I find there's a lot of misleading language in social media. because literally you have like 3 seconds to grab somebody's attention. So
Sure.
if you start faffing with explanations, you lose them.
Yep.
But it's not always about boosting your dopamine. It's not always about activating your vagus nerve. Sometimes you need to actually tone it down because it might be hyperactivated.
You've been looking at this space for, over 20 years. Why do we only hear about like the vagus nerve or the gut microbiome? Why do we only hear about this like recently?
It's a really good question. It's not that we only hear about it recently. I think this is the zeitgeist, isn't it? It's kind of piqued people's interest, and it may not have happened in the past. If you look at the science of the vagus nerve and how it works and the fight or flight response, I mean, the 80s were rife with fight or flight literature, the 90s as well, and it went into the corporate world as well, and people talked about stress in the workplace and all of that. A lot of coaches developed their strategies on the basis of that neuroscience that was developed then.
Okay.
And if you look at animal studies, whether you agree with them or not, they go back to probably the 40s and the 50s, and the real understanding of what goes on we knew from much before, but the literature is there. It's just that 2020 kind of like changed us with what happened with the pandemic and so on. People started talking about mental health. Suddenly stress and anxiety is a thing that people can relate to. Depression, what happens behind what is going on? Well, look, there are cables inside you that kind of like transmit signals, and they are connected to your gut. And suddenly you start seeing books on the shelves about the gut-brain connection. We have known about this for a while, but there hasn't been the awareness or the appetite for it.
So fascinating. So the other quote unquote zeitgeist or piece that I feel quite tuned into, or I was literally just asked before this, what do I think about ADHD medication? Lots of, there's clearly been the last few years where there's been a shortage. There's a big kind of moral, ethical, clearly biological perspective on this. Let's talk about medication, ADHD medication, as it relates to the brain.
So if we start with the science says that, well, I think I know the study that you're referring to as well. It's been published recently, maybe a year or so ago, and it talked about increased risk of psychosis, specifically on amphetamine-based medication. And that's key differentiation as well, because the typical medication that people started using for ADHD years back was not amphetamine-based. It was Ritalin, so methylphenidate.
Yes.
Even though it resembles amphetamine, it actually is not. It's a different drug. And it works in a subtle way differently to amphetamine. So methylphenidate, Ritalin, will just block the reuptake of dopamine and noradrenaline in the space between the neurons in the synapse. So basically there's more of those neurotransmitters floating about and you get the kick. Basically you feel more in tune with your body, you feel like more alert, more focused, all of those things. So people get like these aha moments of taking the medication for the first time. And that can actually reduce impulsivity, improve your emotional regulation, and so on. It can be life-changing for some people.
So they both do that?
They both do that, but also the amphetamine-based medication releases dopamine from pre-synapse, so basically from the neuron that is transmitting the message to the one that is receiving it by opening these vesicles that contain dopamine. Methylphenidate doesn't do that. So the amphetamine-based medication, like Adderall, for example, which is the close you can get to amphetamine, you're doing a double whammy. You're releasing dopamine, and then you're blocking the dopamine and the noradrenaline or norepinephrine in America from being reabsorbed.
Okay.
So the problem, again, is not about boosting dopamine. It's the fact that in ADHD, sometimes it's not that we lack the dopamine, it's that we reabsorb it too quickly. So we might actually produce dopamine enough to get us going, but the neurons that pick it up pick it up so quickly that we run out really
Yes,
quickly.
so depletion is fast.
Exactly. So we need to kind of like block that process. And that's what the Ritalin or the Xagatine or Concerta, all of these medications that are based on methylphenidate will do. The amphetamines will also release dopamine into that synapse. So it's kind of like giving you an extra amount of dopamine to deal with that some people, again, all with a nuance, because the study actually talked about genetic predisposition and all of this kind of stuff that is, mental health history in the family and so on. So it's not for everybody. And again, science always creates a scenario, and it's a theater play, and you have your actors and your actresses and a script. And it doesn't always generalize to the whole of the population.
Yes.
So you create a scenario that is wonderful and it could be very watertight, but it's not necessarily generalizable to the whole of the population.
Yeah, because it's not personalized, right?
Exactly.
It's not based on your brain.
Exactly. So you pick up a sample of people and you do something with them, and then you assume that that's going to happen to, millions of people around the world. Whereas it may be that the study was done in America, the genetics in America are slightly different to the genetics in China. So maybe you replicate the study in China and that doesn't happen. So that is something to take into account as well. So it does sound scary, but at the same time, the amount that they tested is fairly high. So it was an equivalent of 40 milligrams of Adderall, which is a high dose by any stretch of the imagination. And then Adderall is not really prescribed all around the world. So it's more of an American drug. In Europe, it's not really prescribed. The versions of amphetamines that are prescribed in Europe and in the UK are longer release, so it takes longer for the drug to be available to the body.
Okay.
That reduces the risk as well. And also the study showed that the risk didn't apply to methylphenidate-based drugs. So if you're on Concerta, exactly, or just generic methylphenidate long release, it doesn't apply to you. So I think it's about taking into account that for some people it could be life-changing. For some people, they may not agree with them, and okay, they might try something else. And my own experience with the medication was that I took it as at the time that it was life-changing for me, and it took me out of a ditch.
Okay.
I was diagnosed at 47. I was really struggling with loads of stuff like emotional regulation. I was a mess, basically, when I was diagnosed, and the drugs were a real lifesaver. Nearly 18 months in, I kind of like started thinking, I feel that I'm on drugs, but it's like very subtle and I didn't like it. So I talked to my psychiatrist and I said, I think I'm going to go cold turkey. I'm going to do like some supplements and I'm going to take saffron. So she said, okay, wonderful. If you want to do that, then let me know how you go. So fast forward 3 years, I thought I'm feeling messy again. I've got a lot going on. My mom's developing dementia. This kind of, my dad is 92. It's a very complicated family situation. I felt I was struggling to regulate. And I spent the day looking at the computer thinking I've done nothing, stressing because my mind is kind of like racing, intrusive thoughts, all sorts of stuff going on. And I thought, you know what, I need to go back at the worst possible time because the meds are in short supply. Yes. So I'm having a bit of I'm having to go through the system to go back to the meds. But luckily I had a bit of a stash. So I'm basically I've gone on some meds that are out of date, but I'm still taking them because they are still working.
And they work.
And they work, yeah, exactly. So they're only like a year out of date, but I'm on them. And my experience has been better this time, I think, than towards the end of that process where I was feeling I'm on drugs. And some days, it's not like I'm completely, off my face on the meds. It's just a subtle thing that makes you feel like you've had too much coffee or something at certain times of the day.
Okay.
But I'd rather actually have that than be the messy me at the moment. So there's all those kind of considerations to take into account because ideally I might not take the meds, but also I'm thinking, why am I putting this kind of moral dilemma in front of me and thinking about it so ethically? It's like, oh, if I'm on meds, I'm a worse person. If I'm actually better on the meds.
Yeah, and I think you highlight, I had a dad I know whose child has just been diagnosed, and the school are very keen that child goes on ADHD medication. And the father is really unsure.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't know what to do, because there's an element of, oh, of course you want my child to go on medication school. He'll sit still, he'll be behaved, the class will carry on, he'll focus, etc. But the moral and ethical piece of, and I'm being deliberately dramatic here, drugging your child,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't sit so easy with him.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there are going to be loads of people out there who are facing that same challenge. And we know that, the medication works for 8 hours. And I know plenty of parents that have children on medication in the week and not at the weekend. From a neuroscientific perspective, is there anything wrong with children who are ADHD being on medication?
There doesn't seem to be a conclusive body of literature one way or the other. It's looking more towards the safety profile. But then again, you have to question whether the studies have been funded by pharmacological companies and so on. And I don't want to get into conspiratorial theories, because at the end of the day, we need drugs, so we do need pharma companies. I resonate with this father. I would also have the same dilemma. And I feel it. I'm like 51 now, and I'm thinking, I don't want to be on drugs. So there's that stigma as well, associated with that kind of situation. But in terms of what you're doing to your brain, there are studies actually pro drugs on the basis that there is this thing called neuroplasticity, which is the way that your brain reorganizes itself. Mm-hmm. It learns, it adapts, it creates new connections between different parts of the brain. Within the same parts of the brain, it kind of expands the broadband, the bandwidth, part of the brain's capabilities, like a prefrontal cortex, for example. What we do know is that in children who are not medicated, they might struggle with the control of impulses, with the control of emotions, because various segments of the prefrontal cortex are actually not communicating constantly the way they should communicate with the more emotional controlled parts of the brain. So the communication is glitchy and a little bit broken down. And that, with the right amount of neuroplasticity, which is enabled by the drugs, can actually happen, and the child can have a behavior that is probably easier to manage by everybody around the child without feeling that you're actually dragging them.
Yeah.
But the same that I was saying before about, you do something and you think, oh, this is going to sort everything out. The drugs will sort everything out. I don't think that's the case. And it's not the case for the children who still need to learn to live life in a certain way.
Yep.
And it's not the case for adults as well. So if you just think taking the tablet in the morning is going to sort out your emotional mess, but you keep getting into toxic relationships at work or romantic or sexual or whatever, or you dab with alcohol or, whatever. If you don't look at, okay, what is going on in my life, and you just pretend that taking the tablet in the morning is going to sort everything out, you're gaslighting yourself.
Yes.
And the child doesn't have the ability to reflect on all of that, because children don't, they are not adults.
Yeah.
But they have responsible adults, ideally, who should not just look at the drugs as a way out. This is my child without drugs. I'm going to drug them, in inverted commas, and get rid of the naughty behavior.
Yes.
It's a chance for them to actually start creating a lifestyle that doesn't see the ADHD as a flaw. Is literally a neurotype. And that neurotype, in that particular situation, the child will thrive on the drugs, whereas off the drugs, it may struggle.
Yes.
So would you like the child to thrive or to struggle? And then at the same time, you can take care of the microbiome and sports and, nature and all of these things that are wonderful for the brain to have more neuroplasticity as well. So I think in the neurodivergent community, we tend to be very all or nothing. And it's all, you see all these debates, oh, I'm all up for the drugs, or I'm all against the drugs. You can have the drugs and some supplements or some nutrition, some lifestyle modifications. You could have no drugs and a lot of that. There's so many permutations of how you can manage, and ultimately you need to find what works for you.
Do you sleep better on meds? What difference do you see with sleep?
So I sleep okay on meds. Right around the time that I got diagnosed, I had a lot of pain that, I tried to get to the bottom of it. They said it was fibromyalgia.
Mm-hmm.
But I was a bit disappointed with the diagnosis because it's just non-treatable. It's basically, your nervous system is out of whack.
Okay.
And it's just relaying the wrong type of signals to your brain. So you think you have pain, but there's nothing wrong with the areas that you feel the pain in. That's what fibromyalgia is.
Okay.
And it could, it's got links with trauma, which makes sense because I had like childhood trauma. And I'm thinking, why is this all coming out like 40 years after my childhood trauma?
Mm-hmm.
Which can happen.
Sure.
And a lot of people
we hold
tell
it,
you,
right?
Exactly. At that time, I went from sleeping kind of like normally to just my sleep was all over the place. It was broken. I was waking up several times in the night and all of that. And I'm thinking, God, this is awful. With the meds at the time, I started sleeping better.
Mm-hmm.
So it didn't change my sleep pattern so much.
But even the medication isn't working when you're sleeping, right?
Yeah, the medication is not working. So it's only, for me, with the meds that I take, it's just I take one tablet in the morning. And if I need to take a top up, I take a short release in the afternoon.
Okay.
But I don't always take it. In fact, I'll only take it like every now and then. But some people metabolize the meds in a slightly different way. Even the same drugs. Like, for example, they changed me to another brand of medication because mine was not available. And then I started looking through cupboards and I found my stash. So I thought, I'm sure I've got some tabs of the old meds. And when I took the meds that they prescribed me, they're still methylphenidate, but they are delivered in a slightly different way. You get more immediately. You get 30% of the dose immediately as opposed to 20, which was my old meds.
Okay.
And then they are released in a slightly different way because they are trapped. The methylphenidate is enveloped in wax as opposed to in a hard capsule. Okay. So it affects the way that it works. And I was awful. I was like a zombie for like 2 days. I was falling asleep at 10 o'clock in the morning.
Okay.
I started waking up at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It gave me diarrhea.
Okay.
So every drug is likely, every type of medication will have its own kind of a way of working. But also, some people are really fast metabolizers, so they do need the top up.
Okay.
And because doctors tend to be funny about prescribing the short release medication, just because there is this stigma about, it's going to be addictive, which we know it's not.
It's not addictive.
It's not addictive if you have ADHD. It may actually stop you from getting addicted to other things because you're looking for something to compensate and to regulate your emotions. That might be alcohol, might be cigarettes, might be, partying.
Yeah.
So being on the drugs, actually, we do have literature pointing out that if you're on the meds, you might actually reduce the risk of addictions by 30, 40%.
Wow.
And that's significant.
Yes.
So, but still, doctors feel like it's a bit funny to prescribe this short release medication. So they tend to stick with the longer release. And that's a problem when you have somebody having to top up with something that's going to last 8 hours at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Because basically, if they want to go to bed early, if you're, normally tired at like 9 and you want to go to bed, your body might be tired, but your head might still be quite awake.
Yes.
And it's not necessarily your head is spinning with thoughts, because for me, what the meds do, they actually silence my mind.
Okay.
So my mind is a mess all the time. It's like I've got like 100 ideas at the same time, and in Spanish and in English. So it gets even more messy. That. And I'm sat there and my dog is asleep and I'm thinking, I cannot even remember, because it's been 3 years of the meds. Last time my brain was kind of like quiet. And
you're not the first person to say this to me.
Yeah, and it was amazing.
It's made a really big impact on people, and you're kind of no different.
Yeah.
What do we know about neurodivergence and sleep?
What we know about neurodivergence and sleep is that, particularly in autistic people, up to 80% of autistic people can have problems with sleep. It could be that they don't go into all the phases, because you have like 4 phases, and then you have to get into each of the phases for a certain time, and then you complete a cycle, and then you go into another cycle, and so on. And sometimes if you are if you wake up in the middle of a cycle, then you don't complete the cycle properly. And that has an effect on this thing called melatonin,
Yes.
which is a hormone, neurotransmitter, natural thing that your pineal gland, this tiny little gland in the middle of the brain, produces. It's also a very strong antioxidant for the brain, but it helps regulate the circadian rhythm. So it's basically circadian rhythm, again, another technical word. It means the cycles of day and night and how you adapt to those through your pupils and the information your optic nerve is sending to different parts of the brain. So we have these genes called clock genes that actually pick up the signals from your eyes, and they know when it's daytime and when it's nighttime. So you have the seasonal affective disorder, SAD, that affects a lot of people, and neurodivergent people are sensitive to that as well.
Okay.
So we have this kind of like intersection of factors in there. So some genetic factors in autism, and again, there are so many genes that is almost impossible to just pinpoint a particular one, but it tends to be more autism than ADHD. And in ADHD, the sleep issues could be because of the meds, because of the time of taking the meds. And there's always going to be a little bit of a spike profile as well in all neurodivergences. So there's never going to be a pure ADHD or a pure autism. There's always going to be a little bit of overlap between them, a little bit of dyslexia or dyspraxia, or that, there's all of these kind of potential percentage that you might have as a neurodivergent person.
But I find that very interesting that ultimately our optic nerves and what we literally see and the amount of light we're exposed to, forget the time of day, but just the amount of light we're exposed to, is then having an impact on whether it's awake time or sleep time.
Yeah, and animals are very in tune with that. So, if you have a cat or a dog, or, they can actually bypass this mechanism as well, because they, especially living with humans, they get used to lights being on and off and so on. But they do have a natural rhythm that changes with the seasons. And we also have the gut microbiome that we know has a huge effect on circadian rhythms as well. So some people who might be more prone to staying up late, and they do very well working at 11 at night, might have certain types of bacteria in their gut that the person who actually does really well at 6 o'clock in the morning might not have, or the abundance, this relative abundance of the microbes might actually be slightly different. So that's important. And in terms of like how you deal with that in the field of the microbiome, using the microbiome as a target, as you would do in in a pharmacological treatment, so but with natural things, there could be ways to actually target the microbiome just simply by, if you're going to have carbohydrates in the day, maybe have them towards the end of the day. If you tend to be awake late, and that is actually impinging into your routine, because carbohydrates will allow you to generate more tryptophan into your system, or sources of tryptophan as well. That could be, like poultry, for example, pumpkin seeds. Tryptophan will be released into your gut and then into your bloodstream. And that's going to then contribute to more serotonin to be produced as well, which is linked to melatonin as well. So serotonin is converted to melatonin. And also serotonin makes you happy and sleepy. So
yes. So my body is drawn to carbohydrates at the end of the day. Not in the day, not at breakfast, not lunchtime, but my body feels drawn, and we eat dinner very early, but I'm drawn to carbohydrates.
So there's an intuition perhaps going on in there that you feel, you feel a certain way when you do that, and then you've learned that behavior without being aware of it.
Okay.
And I feel that what's really important in all these conversations we're having is that when you create awareness and you create self-awareness, and then you have a little bit of knowledge of the science, you don't need to become a complete scientist, but you have some knowledge, some self-awareness, and you're prepared to actually sit with yourself. And instead of actually just learning from an Instagram reel in 30 seconds, how do you actually feel? How do I feel when I eat this way? when I have
Yes.
potatoes or rice or pasta or a pita bread or whatever at the end of the day, as opposed to having it earlier in the day.
Because it feels counterintuitive to me. I'm listening to my body, but my head is telling me, whoa, you don't want to have all these carbohydrates at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But my body's saying different, and I'm going with my body rather than listening to my head. And I've not looked into it. That's what I've
But
noticed.
you feel a certain way, and it's not about eating a whole bowl of rice. It's about, like binging. It's about being aware of how those carbs are going to have a different effect at different times of the day, and that's all down to the circadian rhythm. And again, circadian nutrition is a thing.
Yep.
So there's chrononutrition
Okay.
as a subject that looks into how when you eat foods at a certain time of the day, they will have a different impact on your body.
Wow.
And that's one of the very simple ways of you to get better sleep, by putting a small amount of carbohydrate in the evening in your meal.
So and I know you've seen this article as well, Miguel. They've done these brain imaging scans in the US that they reckon are a pretty high early predictor of autism.
Mm-hmm.
And that from a genetic perspective, they can predict autism or find autism much earlier than waiting for behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking like with 80 to 95% accuracy. What do you think about that?
This is based on an imaging technique that's called transport-based morphometry. And it
Catchy.
looks, it's a mouthful. And then what it does is basically just taking multiple images at that such a small level that you can actually almost take a photograph of the genes. So you identify copies of genes that are associated with autism, and you think, okay, you need to fit the profile of an autistic person, you need to have so many copies of this gene and so many deletions, which are the copies that should be there but are not there. So you're looking for blanks as well as positives.
Mm-hmm.
In a particular profile, and if that fits with the profile that is the autistic profile, then you are basically diagnosed as autistic. So I find that fascinating. There's been another study as well to do with prediction of autism from the gut microbiome and blood from umbilical cords of very young babies, like under one.
Yeah.
Done with 16,000 babies and so on. I find that completely fascinating, but I'm a bit worried about the dark side, because the dark side is science has its own language, and sometimes it can feel a bit demeaning to people who, like myself, I've actually adopted my neurodivergence as part of my identity. Mm-hmm. And it's important for me. Mm-hmm. So when somebody's talking about a person who is either autistic or suffers from autism, mm-hmm. or diagnosed with autism, which is not what I like to see, or a healthy control. So the healthy control is healthy. And that's what neuronormativity is about. You create the norm. Mm-hmm. The healthy kind of control is the norm. And then you expect everybody to be healthy and normal. And because they are not, then they are autistic. These articles talk about treatment. And you think, okay, so are you going to treat my autism? But if I do have sleep issues because I'm autistic and I can improve my sleep, I can understand that. But that's the granularity that is not quite there in these studies. So when they talk about treatment or prevention, it worries me, because it almost makes me feel prevention. Okay, so if you can prevent autism, does that mean that there's going to be a choice if they could prevent it for a child to be born because the child is going to be autistic?
Yeah, I have my own battles sometimes in my head with, knowing that I'm neurodivergent, knowing the propensity genetics wise and hereditary wise for that to be passed down. But the thought of there being scans and choices or decisions, or yes, the child is going to be autistic, and that even being a choice
Well, exactly.
is like, makes me feel sick.
Yeah, or even when you've had the baby and they tell you the baby is autistic, and already it creates, there's a huge amount of stigma because autism is so complex, and there's such a spectrum as well. You know, you could have extremely high needs or relatively lower needs. Is that going to create a situation with the parents who may not be all embracing of that, because not everybody's going to be super cool and say, oh, I really, value neurodivergent identity. You just don't know.
Yeah.
And so you're creating this kind of, again, you're expecting everybody to play this role in this kabuki play of normality that we have invented, because everything needs to have, to be as close to normal as possible. And when you're talking about neuro things, is neuronormativity. You're expected to behave by following that script.
Yeah.
And that's what worries me, that at one level we have people like you and me and many others out there actually embracing our identity and talking about it. And it has become a really important part of my life, because I see my life from a different angle now. And I can make sense of
how your brain works.
Loads of stuff that I'm thinking, okay, well, I thought I was a complete weirdo when I was growing up. And now I can understand why I didn't have like a whole like 30 friends. I only had like 4 friends. And then you have these other kind of like predictions and imaging studies. And I'm thinking, yeah, the dark side worries me.
Yeah, and that takes me to a few things of it being almost a race to create the perceptions in society that it's not a bad thing, and that if you are autistic, there is nothing wrong. There are challenges, there are skills, but there's nothing wrong with you. And therefore, the sort of more anthropological race to beat the science, so that these kind of projects or where they could go to don't even take place because they're not needed. We don't, as far as I'm aware, we don't have this kind of this predisposition imaging or testing for, I don't know, loads of other things, whether it's diabetes or cancer or other genetic,
which are much more needed.
Yes. Yeah. So why don't we focus our efforts on there? I'm fascinated by the idea of looking at an autistic brain, and it blows my mind to think that you can see genes, and you can see categorically, as you're saying, like the depletions, the positives, like you can actually see it. That's incredible that we've got to that point that we can do that. But yeah, I share the concern of, I guess it's like all these things, isn't it? Hammers are great in the right hands and really useful, but in the wrong hands and for the wrong reasons can be really troublesome. So yeah, I feel like that's an area we need to keep an eye on. I wanted to finish with, I don't often sit here with other autistic ADHD people, and there's some conflict there. I think of my brain, I guess, a bit like I've got an accelerator and a gear stick. Not a brake, but an accelerator and a gear stick. My ADHD is definitely the accelerator. Do you feel that conflict?
Yeah, definitely. And that's a really great analogy. I feel with mine is more kind of internal, external kind of thing. Like for many years of my life, I was very outgoing and kind of like, always leaving the party, the last person and all this kind of stuff. I think that's very much my ADHD. Whereas now that looking at my autistic self, I'm quite happy to just like look inward and actually just be with myself and think, I don't need to be like joining your group or your party or for as wonderful as it sounds. Actually, I just want to just do what I want to do.
How do you deal with that push and pull?
I think I just learned to honor it and not feel, again, like the stigma of being too ADHD and too messy or too monotropic and too hyper-focused on something or too antisocial. And I think the more you actually feel comfortable with that and you don't see it as a flaw, but as a compliment, you are more because of those two sides as opposed to be broken because of the conflict. And the more you portray that image to other people, the more they actually learn that that's the way you are and they respect it. And again, sometimes when you consume certain media via, a very eloquent influencer or whatever might say, oh, this is me, I'm completely broken because I'm ADHD. Your experience might be completely different. But sometimes we don't spend time just sitting with ourselves and actually saying, I'm going to cultivate some awareness of what life is for me, because we're scrolling all the time and we're not spending time within. We kind of like everything is external. And I understand that from my ADHD point of view as well, that I always want some stimulation, something visual, something I can touch.
Yep.
So I'm quite addicted to my phone. But now I realize that I can put it down and I can be with myself. And that's my autistic self actually saying, have a minute and it's fine.
Yeah, and I think the awareness of, two things based on what you said. Number one, there's a certain amount of kindness or just being gentle and not having to go, oh, that's being ADHD and that's being autistic and that's
Exactly.
being ADHD and that's being autistic. I feel like I could tie myself up in knots if I'm trying to like analyze what's what all throughout the day. So yeah, I like the honoring piece, and I guess I'm learning how to channel them both in different ways, and sort of trying to find the good, obviously, naturally, the good bits about both. So last question, the item that we usually ask people to bring, you're in the process of making, Miguel.
Yay. So the item is a book. It's about ADHD, something that's become really important through just learning more about myself and things that have happened to me like much earlier in my life, and the trauma, kind of like, reliving and exploring my trauma from 40 odd years ago. I've learned that compassion is very important, and particularly self-compassion. And if you go back to the science, what we do know is that neurodivergent people are very self-critical, and it's a reflection of all the situations that we have gone through in life, bullying, being told we are weirdos. We end up internalizing that narrative, and we believe that we are broken, that we are like the oddball.
Yep.
I was missing kindness and compassion. It was all a bit too clinical. And so I spoke to my editor and I thought, oh my God, they're gonna drop me. They're gonna say, no, you're joking. And I said, I just need to rewrite the book in a different way. And they said, okay, fine, write it before the end of the year. So I'm basically on the last push now to write it. And it will have all the science and the nutrition and the gut brain and everything else, but it's all through an angle of self-compassion and also very practical.
Yeah.
So it's all of this kind of like adding a bit of softness to the science, because I think science can be sometimes a bit harsh.
Yeah, I
Can
mean,
be
there's
bit
a
clinical.
reason why there's a phrase hard science, right?
Yeah.
And I think given that the majority of people are not neuroscientists like you, and I take it you're writing a book because you want it to be helpful. Ultimately, more people can read it, and therefore more people can have the takeaways.
Yeah, and it's about being authentic as well. It's kind of, I think I was missing that. I was thinking, am I trying to be something that I'm not? Or am I not just showing a face of myself that I'm scared to show? Because as a neuroscientist should just look like in the cover, I should just have like a white coat and look like really serious. Whereas I'm like fun and like, and I'm soft. And I wanted for the book to just be me, as opposed to just a portion of me.
Yep.
Because the whole journey that I'm on is to be me, and that includes my ADHD and my autism and my being queer and everything else. So it's not just like one thing only. It's about the holistic aspect of who I am.
Yep.
And I think I was missing out on just showing up as Miguel.
Yep.
Because I was too worried about like being Dr. Miguel.
Yeah, Dr. Miguel.
So, and I'm Miguel at the end of the day.
Well, wish you luck with finishing the book.
Thank you,
Miguel. And I feel like we just scratched the surface, because there's so much great depth and complexity, obviously, to our brains and our guts, regardless of neurodivergence. And so you throw that lens on there, and I know there'll be lots of people who will be interested, because it's all part of understanding ourselves. So thanks, because I think you've given people loads to take away and hyper-focused research on. Yeah, thanks, Miguel.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.